Battle of Okinawa was the largest fight of the Pacific War. More people died during the Battle of Okinawa than when the atomic bombs were set off on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the Battle of Okinawa, more than 38,000 Americans were wounded and 12,000 were killed. The number of deaths and casualties for the Japanese and Okinawan people were much worse. They had more than 107,000 people killed and 100,000 people who were perished. In total, there were 34 Allied ships and aircraft that sunk, and 368 ships and planes were severely damaged. Okinawa was considered home to about 300,000 people. At the end of that battle, it was home to around 196,000. By October 1944, Okinawa was targeted by the Allies and is where they decided to invade. This operation was known as Operation Iceberg. This operation allowed the assembly of the greatest naval army. On October 10, 1944, Admiral Halsey instructed 200 of his planes to attack Okinawa's capital, Naha. Halsey's troops attacked 5 separate times. In the middle of March 1945, over 1,300 American fleets of ships docked off Okinawa and started the naval bombardment. There were also many kamikazes during this battle. On March 18, 1945, the first kamikaze attack of the Battle of Okinawa happened. There were 1,465 kamikaze flights in total, and they were able to sink 30 American ships and damage 164 others. In April 1945, the collapse of Germany almost came with their resistance in the European campaign. The Japanese were also determined at the same time to resist the Americans from advancing around the Pacific. Okinawa was important to the Allies because they would be able to limit Japan's sea line communication and isolate them from the raw materials in the south that they needed. Okinawa was also known as the location that air bases were at and as Japan's front line. The Battle of Okinawa was divided into 4 phases. From April 1st to the 4th, Americans wanted to advance to the eastern coast. Second, from April 5th to the 18th, they wanted to clear the northern part of the island. Phase 3, April 10th to June 26th, they wanted to occupy the outlying islands. And the final phase, April 6th to June 21st, the main battle. The invasion began on April 1st, 1945. 60,000 American troops landed. Included in this battle were 10 of the oldest American battleships. Some were known as the Pearl Harbor survivors. The most well-known ships were the USS Tennessee, Maryland, and West Virginia. These battleships combined fired 3,800 tons of shells during the first 24 hours. The Japanese decided not to defend their beaches because it was part of their strategy. They wanted to avoid as many casualties as possible. James J. Fahey joined the Navy in October 1942. He became a seaman first class aboard the cruiser USS Montpelier and saw action from the Solomon Islands through the end of the war. On November 27, 1944, the Montpelier was in the Leyte Gulf in support of the American invasion that would eventually liberate the Philippines. The task force that the Montpelier was a part of consisted of 18 ships, and in the morning they were refueling, the most vulnerable time for an enemy attack. To protect themselves, the ships formed a defensive circle around the fuel-laden tanker, while each took its turn at refueling. If the army arrived, sailors armed with axes aboard the refueling warship would cut the fuel lines to allow the ship to get into battle position and as far away from the tanker as possible. James Fahey kept a diary of his experiences. We join his story as the Montpelier's alarms announce a Japanese attack. Today we have James Fahey with us, and James, what we did is we found your journal from when you were in the Navy, and we were wondering if you could read us some of the entries.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Here's a good one. At 10:50 a.m. this morning, general quarters sounded. All hands went to their battle stations. Out of the clouds I saw a big Japanese bomber come crashing down into the water. It was not long after that when a force of about 30 Japanese planes attacked us, dive bombers and torpedo planes. Our 2 ships were busy getting away from the tanker because one bomb hit on the tanker and it would be all over for the 3 ships. Japanese planes were coming at us from all directions. Before the attack started, we did not know that they were suicide planes with no intention of returning to their base. Right off the bat, a Japanese plane made a suicide dive at the cruiser St. Louis, and there was a big explosion, and flames were seen shortly from the stern. The Japanese planes were falling all around us. The air was full of Japanese machine gun bullets. Japanese planes and bombs were hitting all around us. Some of the ships were hit by suicide planes, bombs, and machine gun fire. It was a fight to the finish. While all of this was taking place, our ship had its hands full with Japanese planes. We knocked our share of planes down, but we also got hit by 3 suicide planes, but lucky for us, they dropped their bombs before they crashed into us. In the meantime, exploding planes overhead were showering us with their parts. It looked like it was raining plane parts. A Japanese dive bomber crashed into one of the 40mm mounts, but lucky for them, it dropped its bomb on another ship before crashing. Parts of the plane flew everywhere when it crashed into the mount. Part of the motor hit Tomlinson, and he had chunks of it all over him, his stomach, back, legs, etc. The rest of the crew were wounded. Most of them were sprayed with gasoline from the plane. Tomlinson was thrown a great distance, and at first they thought he was knocked over the side. They finally found him in a corner in bad shape. Planes were falling all around us. Bombs were coming too close for comfort. The deck near my mountain was covered with blood, guts, brains, tongues, scalps, hearts, arms, etc. from Japanese pilots. The Japanese bodies were blown into all sorts of pieces. I cannot think of everything that happened because too many things were happening that time.
Thank you, James, for sharing with us your personal experience. It's really appreciated.
Anytime.
Yamato was Japan's largest battleship. It was dispatched to Okinawa on April 6, 1945. The Americans were aware of the ship, and they had their submarine, Hackleback, track down its movements. Vice Admiral Mark Mister launched an airstrike on April 7th at 10 a.m. It took 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes to finally end Yamato. The ship ended up blowing up and sinking. Yamato's crew consisted of 2,747 men, but in the end, only 263 survived. The Americans lost 10 planes and 12 crew members. This was the last Japanese naval battle for the rest of the war. General Ushijima of the Japanese decided to withdraw his troops to the Kiamu Peninsula because of the heavy pressure on the Shurian line. The movement of his ships began on May 23rd. Just during the first week of June, American forces only captured 465 troops and claimed 62,548 killed. It took 2 weeks of brutal fighting before the end of the battle was declared. General Ushijima committed suicide on June 16th because he thought that he did everything that he already can to prove his duty and service to the Emperor. On September 7th, 1945, at the Kadena Air Base, the document ending the Battle of Okinawa was signed.
The men you lost on the beaches and in the jungles are the heroes in this war. Your unit's success and courage will not be forgotten. You have preserved the stars and stripes in the South Pacific and in Asia. America salutes you.